The cough above the kitchen ceiling was wet now. Jenny Hollow heard it through 3 floors of stone, and she knew the sound. She had heard it once before, in a small upstairs room in a village outside Bristol, the year she turned 14, the year her father was hanged. That cough had a colour and a shape, and she could draw it from memory if anyone had ever asked. No one ever asked. She set the copper pan down with a hand that did not shake, because hands that shook in the kitchens of Ravensmoor Hall got slapped, and slapped hands could not work, and a maid who could not work was a maid who was turned out into the dark. So Jenny did not shake. She listened. Above her, on the floor that held the great ballroom, 200 guests were dancing under chandeliers the size of carriages. Below her, in the under kitchens, the scullery girls were peeling something for the morning. Above the ballroom in the nursery wing, a 5-year-old boy named Thomas was burning with the fever that had killed his Uncle Marcus 7 years earlier. Jenny knew this because she had carried up his broth twice that day, and twice she had seen his small chest fight the air like a fish on a stone. The physician had been sent for at noon. It was now near midnight. He had not come. She thought of her father then, only for a heartbeat, because longer than a heartbeat was dangerous. Henry Hollow, apothecary. The man who had taught her which leaves brought down a fever and which leaves made it climb. The man who had been falsely sworn against in a courthouse and dropped through a trapdoor and buried in unconsecrated ground. A kitchen rat was what they called girls like her now. She had borne the name for 10 years. Tonight she was going to ruin herself. Jenny took off her apron. She folded it the way her mother had taught her, corner to corner, smooth as ironing. Then she walked out of the kitchen with empty hands and a still face, and no one looked at her because no one ever looked at her, and that was the only thing that had ever protected her, and tonight it was going to be the thing that saved a child. In the back passage near the cloakroom she stopped. She had been planning this for an hour. The discarded gown had been there since 6 that evening, hanging on a peg under a dust sheet, abandoned by a guest who had ripped a seam and changed into her travel dress. Pale green silk, a loose ribbon at the waist, a mask of feathers and grey lace dropped on the bench beneath it. Jenny did not ask who it belonged to. She did not want to know. She slid out of her grey kitchen dress in the dark, and the silk went over her shoulders with a sound like water. She tied the ribbon, lifted the mask and fastened it behind her ear, and her own face vanished behind a careful curtain of nothing. For the first time in 10 years, she thought she was about to step into a room as a person. The medicine was already hidden in the pocket she had sewn into the underside of the borrowed gown. A small twist of paper, willow bark ground to powder, elderflower, a pinch of the leaves her father had once kept in a green tin labelled with a word he had written in his own hand. She had no choice but to cross the ballroom. The servants' stair was guarded by the under-butler tonight, because guests sometimes wandered in search of a private room, and the family did not want them straying. The only door to the nursery wing was through the ballroom and up the main staircase. There was no other way. She stepped into the corridor. Music spilled from the open double doors ahead like light from a fireplace. A waltz, slow and steady, 3 beats to a bar, the sort of waltz a duke calls for when he does not want anyone to talk to him. She walked toward it. Her heart did not so much beat as drag, knock, as if a hand inside her chest were trying to remind her she could still turn back. She did not turn back. Above her, through 3 floors of stone, a child she had bathed that morning was fighting for air, and inside her pocket was the only thing in this house that might save him. She crossed the threshold of the ballroom. She did not look at anyone. She walked along the edge of the room behind the line of guests, as if she were a guest herself who had grown tired of being looked at. She was, she realized, almost invisible inside the mask. It was a strange feeling, this kind of invisibility. She had been the other kind, the unseen kitchen kind, all her life. This one felt like being held by something warm. She had reached the second mirror, and she could see the main staircase through the 3rd arch when a hand closed around her gloved fingers. A voice spoke very close to her ear. "May I have this dance?" She froze. The hand around her fingers was gloved in black. The wrist behind the glove wore a black mourning band. She looked up, slowly, and saw a man in a black coat looking down at her, as if he had been looking at her for a long time, and only now was waiting for her to look back. She knew his face. Every maid in this house knew his face. He was the Duke of Ravensmoor, and he was drunk, and he was the saddest man she had ever seen. She thought, very calmly, that she was going to die in this room tonight. Then she thought of the child upstairs, and she said yes. Her father had taught her 3 things before they came for him. He taught her plants, and he taught her to read, and he taught her to dance. Henry Hollow had been the apothecary in a market town outside Bristol, and he had married a clergyman's daughter, and the clergyman's daughter had insisted that her child be raised to walk into any room and stand straight in it. So when Jenny was 8, her mother had taught her to curtsy, and when she was 10, her father had set down his pestle and showed her a waltz in their small front parlour, between the table where he ground willow bark and the chair where he ground iron. 3 beats to a bar, the man's hand at the small of your back. Look at his collar, not his face. Breathe out on the 2nd count. Step on the 3rd. The Duke of Ravensmore put his hand at the small of her back. She breathed out on the 2nd count. He was tall enough that she did not have to lower her gaze far to land it on his collar. The collar was very neat. The mourning band on his sleeve was older than the coat. Old grief, she thought, which was a thing she knew very well. The room turned around them as if the room were the thing dancing. He smelled of brandy and rain, although the night outside was dry. She wondered if the rain was an older smell that he could not get out of his coats. Marcus had died on a wet day. She remembered that from the housekeeper's gossip. A wet day in November 7 years ago, this very week. This was the anniversary. That was why he was drunk. That was why he was dancing. He spoke once, halfway through the waltz, in a voice low enough that only she could hear. "You are not on the list of guests." Jenny did not breathe. "I would have remembered," he said. She kept her face perfectly still behind the mask. She thought of the child upstairs. She thought of the medicine in her pocket. She thought of her father, telling her in their parlour when she was 10 that a brave woman is not one who does not feel fear. A brave woman is one who feels it and steps on the 3rd count anyway. She stepped on the 3rd count. "I came in late," she said. It was not a lie. She had come into this room very late indeed. The Duke of Ravensmore did not answer. He guided her through the next turn. His hand at the small of her back was not heavy. He held her the way a man holds something he has not been allowed to touch in a long time. It was the most polite touch of her life. She thought of the cough above the ceiling. The waltz had 2 more turns, then a slow drift toward the orchestra, then a final cadence, and then she could curtsy and go. 2 more turns. She felt the 2nd turn under her feet, and then a woman in violet at the edge of the floor saw her, and the woman in violet went very still. The Dowager Duchess of Ravensmore had a habit of standing at the edge of any ballroom she entered, as if the room were a chessboard, and she were considering her opening move. She wore violet for evenings, because violet was almost black, and she liked the suggestion of mourning without the commitment. Her hair was iron grey and pinned high. Her face had been beautiful once, and had decided, on a date she alone remembered, that beauty was a frivolous thing she would not require any further. She had been watching her son cross the room. She had seen him stop a woman she did not recognise. She had seen him put his hand at the small of that woman's back. She had thought at first that her son was finally taking pleasure in something, and she had felt a faint surprise. Then her eyes had travelled down the dancing woman, slowly, the way a cat's eyes travel a sparrow, and they had stopped at the pale green silk. The Dowager Duchess knew that gown. She had ordered it herself 8 years ago for her son's wife, Eleanor. She had chosen the green because it suited Eleanor's eyes. She had chosen the ribbon because Eleanor had asked for ribbon. She had paid for it from her own household allowance. Eleanor had worn it twice, and then she had died in childbirth, and the gown had been packed away and forgotten in an upstairs press, and the Dowager Duchess had ordered several times that it not be touched. It was being touched now. It was being worn by a woman in a feathered mask, in her son's hand, on her ballroom floor. The Dowager Duchess set down her glass of orgeat. She did it carefully, because the moment was an important one, and important moments required a certain economy of movement. She stepped once off the edge of the dance floor and began to walk. Around her the dancers continued, the orchestra continued, the chandeliers continued to drip light. She was not yet running, because Dowager Duchesses do not run. She would run in a moment. The waltz ended. Jenny curtsied. The Duke bowed. He did not let go of her gloved hand at once. He looked at her, through her mask, the way a man looks at a window when he is trying to see through it to a person inside. Then he let her hand go. She turned. She walked toward the main staircase. She did not run, because running would have been the end of her. She walked. She crossed the threshold of the ballroom. The hall opened in front of her. The main staircase rose ahead, carpet the colour of dried blood, brass rods, 2 stories of marble. Beyond the staircase at the top was the corridor to the nursery wing. Beyond the corridor, behind a door painted pale blue, was a boy who had been bathing this morning in lukewarm water and laughing because the soap had gone up his nose. She set her foot on the first stair. The Dowager Duchess's voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The acoustics of the Great Hall of Ravensmoor were designed by a man in 1742 who had wanted any word spoken at the foot of the staircase to be heard in the gallery above. The Dowager Duchess knew this. She had grown up in this house. She said only one word, and the entire ball heard it. Stop. Jenny stopped. Behind her, the music in the ballroom was still playing, but the guests nearest the doors had turned, and the guests behind them had turned, and the gallery above her had turned. 200 faces, 200 sets of eyes. The Dowager Duchess walked into the hall, and she walked the way a magistrate walks into a court that has been waiting for her. She climbed the first step, then the second. She came to a halt 3 steps below Jenny. She lifted a gloved hand, not to Jenny's face but to the mask itself, and took it off. She did it slowly. She did it with 2 fingers and a thumb the way you take a feather off a cake. The mask came away with a small sound like paper. Jenny's face was bare, in the Hall of Ravensmoor, under 200 chandeliers and 200 sets of eyes. The silence was not gradual. It arrived all at once. The Dowager Duchess looked at the mask in her own hand. Then she looked at Jenny's face. Then she lifted her chin so that her voice would carry up the staircase and into the gallery, and out through the open doors of the ballroom, and into every corner of the only house Jenny had ever lived in. "A kitchen rat," she said, in my daughter-in-law's dress. 200 people did not breathe. Jenny did not weep. She did not plead. She stood on the staircase in a stolen gown, with her face bare, and she looked the Dowager Duchess in the eyes, and she did not say a word. She could not say a word. Because at that exact moment, from the top of the staircase, from the corridor that led to the nursery wing, from behind a door painted pale blue, a small voice called down. The voice was wet. The voice was thin. The voice was the voice of a child who had been waiting too long. "Jenny," the voice said, "I can't breathe." The Duke of Ravensmoor had followed his mother into the hall. He had stopped at the foot of the staircase with his black-gloved hand on the banister because something in his mother's voice had stopped him. He looked up at Jenny. He looked at her face. He looked at her hands. And then, slowly, he looked at the thing she was holding in the hidden pocket she had begun to lift through the silk of the borrowed gown. A small twist of paper, the corner of an apothecary's fold. His eyes moved from the paper to her face, to the corridor at the top of the stairs, to the door painted pale blue. He was a clever man, the Duke of Ravensmoor. He had been clever even when he was drunk, and clever even when he was grieving, and clever even at 6 years old, the day he found his brother Marcus reading his mother's letters under the rose hedge. He saw the shape of a thing very fast. He saw the shape of this thing in less than 2 seconds. What he saw, in those 2 seconds, was this: a woman in green silk on his staircase, with a twist of paper in her pocket, and his son's voice calling down through the gallery, and his mother 3 steps below her, with a stripped mask in her hand. He saw that the woman had not crossed his ballroom to attend his ball. He saw that she had danced 1 waltz with him to keep from being noticed, and that not being noticed was something she had been doing in this house for a long time. He saw that everything in his world had been arranged, in this exact moment, against the woman who had walked through it to save his only living child. He felt, very precisely, 2 things he had not felt in 7 years. He felt warm, and then he felt, with great clarity, ashamed of his mother. He looked at his mother. He said 1 sentence. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "She stays." That was the end of beat 1. Let us go upstairs. Jenny Hollow was 24 years old that November. She had been born in a small market town 2 days' ride from Bristol, in a house above an apothecary's shop, where the smell of mint and dried bramble lived in every curtain. Her mother had been a clergyman's daughter, who had married down for love. Her father had been an apothecary, who had married up for the same reason. They had been, by all accounts, an extremely happy household. Even the cat had liked them. Her father, Henry Hollow, kept 3 rooms of books, 2 of them about plants and 1 about prayer. He read the prayer books on Sundays and the plant books on every other day, and he taught his only child, who was a daughter, what every leaf was for. By the time she was 9, Jenny could tell willow bark from cherry bark by the smell of the steam. By 11, she could compound a fever powder from memory. The trouble began the year she turned 14. A man named Lord Carrick came to her father's shop one afternoon in March. He was a thin lord with a long jaw and a way of looking at women that made her mother send her into the back room. He bought a bottle of digitalis tincture. He paid in coin. He left. 2 weeks later, Lord Carrick was dead. His widow was 22 and beautiful, and had been seen several times that spring in a carriage with a man who was not her husband. The man who was not her husband was sent abroad before the inquest. The widow inherited everything. The inquest needed someone. Henry Hollow had sold the bottle. Henry Hollow had signed for it in his book. Henry Hollow could not afford a barrister. Henry Hollow's name was on the page. Henry Hollow was hanged the 2nd week of June. The shop was taken for debts. The books were sold. The cat ran away. Jenny, 14, with no living relations and a name that could not be spoken in any decent house within 20 miles, was given 2 weeks by her mother's cousin, and then turned out. The cousin was not cruel. The cousin was simply afraid. There was a difference, Jenny had learned, and the difference did not feed you. She had walked east for 3 days. She had eaten the apples she could reach without trespassing. On the 4th day she had come to the gatehouse of Ravensmoor Hall, where the housekeeper had been hiring a scullery girl, and where no one had asked her last name twice. She had given it as Holland just once when she signed the indenture. The housekeeper had not bothered to check. For 10 years she had been Jenny Holland in the books and Jenny Hollow only in her own head. She had peeled potatoes. She had scoured pots. She had moved from scullery to kitchen, from kitchen to the upstairs trays, from upstairs trays to the nursery passage. She had not raised her voice. She had not cried in public. She had not let anyone see her read. She had read, though, at night, in the housekeeper's cast-off newspapers, in the old almanacs the cook used to line her drawers. She had even twice slipped into the library when the family was at Bath and read herself blind for an hour at a time. She had also kept, very carefully, in a tin under her bed, the only 3 things she had brought with her from her father's house: a small notebook in his hand, a pinch of dried elderflower, and a folded letter he had written to her the morning before they came for him, telling her that he was innocent, telling her where his other notebooks were buried, telling her that he loved her, telling her that one day, if she lived long enough, she might be able to use what he had taught her to save someone who deserved saving. That last line had carried her 10 years. The hall was the only home she had now. It was also her cage. She could not leave without a character reference from the housekeeper, and the housekeeper would not give her one because the housekeeper had become attached to her work. She could not write home because there was no home to write to. She could not save because her wages went straight to the cobbler when her boots wore through, and the boots wore through every winter. She could not even fall ill, because a maid who fell ill was a maid who was sent to the workhouse, and the workhouse was a place from which Jenny Hollow had heard, in 10 years of listening, exactly nobody return. The cage was not made of bars. It was made of references and boots and silence. She had seen the Duke himself only at distance 3 or 4 times each year, on the rare occasions he had been in residence. He had been at the family hunting lodge in the Scottish borders for most of the 7 years since his brother Marcus died, returning to Ravensmoor only for short stretches in spring, and only because the county required it. He had come back this autumn for his son. He had been at the hall for 6 weeks. He had not, in those 6 weeks, set foot below stairs once, and Jenny did not believe he had ever seen her face. She was not a person to him. She was a kind of weather inside his house, like the smell of bread on a Tuesday morning, present and unremarked. Then in October, the cough started in the nursery, and Jenny Hollow understood, for the first time in 10 years, that her cage was about to have a door. The boy's name was Thomas. He was 5. He was the only child of the Duke of Ravensmoor and his late wife Eleanor, who had died bringing him into the world. He had grey eyes like his father, and a slightly stubborn jaw, and an unreasonable fondness for buttered carrots. He had been bathed by Jenny 3 mornings a week for the last 14 months, because the nursery maid did not like cold water, and Jenny did not mind it, and Thomas had insisted, in the way that small children do, that he would be bathed by the kitchen lady, or not bathed at all. The first morning Thomas had chosen her had been in September, when his regular nursery maid, a Mrs. Penny, had been called away to her sister's wedding. Jenny had been sent up with the breakfast tray because nobody else had been free, and she had set it on the dresser and turned to go, because a kitchen maid did not stand about in the nursery wing. She had not expected to see the boy at all. He had been sitting up in bed in a long white nightshirt, looking at the ceiling, and he had said, without looking at her, "Are those the right ones?" She had stopped at the door. She had thought, for one careful second, that she ought to pretend not to hear, because the boy was the heir of the house, and the heir of the house was not in conversation with the girl who brought the tray. Then she had looked up at the ceiling, and her breath had caught a little. His mother had painted the constellations there in the last month of her life. Jenny had heard about the painted ceiling from the housekeeper, who had heard about it from the head housemaid, who had stood in the room while it was being done. The painting was clumsy in places. The Duchess Eleanor had not been a trained painter. She had only wanted to leave her son a sky he could look at after she was gone. There were 7 constellations on that ceiling. Jenny knew 6 of them by heart, because her father, in the same parlour where he had taught her to dance, had owned a small folding star map he liked to spread on the table on summer evenings. She had learned them before she could spell them. She had said, very quietly, "The cluster on the western side is wrong by about 3 handspans. Orion's belt should not be above the lion. It belongs beside the bull." The boy had sat up properly. He had asked her how she knew. She had told him. Some of it. The part about her father owning a star map. Not the rest. He had listened with his whole body, the way only small children listen, with his small mouth slightly open and his fingers gone still on the counterpane. When she had finished, he had said, "Then come back tomorrow morning, please. I want to know the rest. Mrs. Penny will not mind." Mrs. Penny had minded a great deal, but the boy was the Duke's heir, and his small voice in this house carried farther than anyone realised, and the next morning Jenny had gone up with the breakfast tray again, and the morning after, and the morning after that, until the housekeeper had simply added bath time to her duties, without remarking on it. The boy had taught Jenny, over 14 months, how to count bubbles in his bath water. Jenny, in return, had taught him every constellation that was visible above Bristol in any month of the year, and several that were only visible from the equator, which she had never seen and had read about in an old astronomical almanac in the housekeeper's drawer. She had not known, when she began bathing him, that she would come to love him. Loving was not a thing she had been given permission to do since she was 14. The first time she had understood that she loved him had been on a Tuesday in February, when he had got soap in his eye and had begun to cry, and she had said his name, and he had reached blindly through the water for her hand and taken it without seeing her, the way a child takes the hand of a person it trusts in the dark. Loving Thomas had become, after that, an act of small, private mutiny. She had carried it inside her chest the way another woman might carry a hidden letter. She did not think anyone in the house, with the possible exception of the boy himself, understood what those bath mornings had given her. She had been a kitchen maid in this hall for 10 years before she had been spoken to in a full sentence by anyone who lived above the kitchen stairs. The first person who had done it had been a 5-year-old boy who had wanted to know about a painted ceiling. In the 2nd week of October, he caught a cold. By the 3rd week, the cold was a cough. By the 4th week, the cough was wet and rising. Jenny had recognised the sound the first time it happened, and her hands had gone cold over the basin because she had heard it before, in a small upstairs room in a village outside Bristol, the year she turned 14, the year her father told her about lung fever and what it sounded like. She had told the nursery maid. The nursery maid had told the housekeeper had told the steward had told the Duke had sent for the physician had not come. The physician was a Dr. Crale, a man in his 60s who lived in the village, and who was, by November, drinking a bottle of port at lunch. The Duke had retained him because his father had retained him. The Dowager Duchess had refused to retain anyone else, because no one else lived close enough to be summoned in a winter storm. Dr. Crale had been sent for, twice in 2 days, and had sent back word that he would come in the morning, and the morning had not produced him. The Dowager Duchess had not insisted. The Dowager Duchess, in fact, had not gone up to the nursery wing once during the boy's illness. She had said it was not her place. She had also said it was important the household keep to its plans, and the masked ball had been on the calendar for 6 months, and important guests were expected. By the night of the ball, Thomas was burning at 104 degrees, and his nursery maid was in tears in the linen room, and Jenny Hollow was standing in the kitchen with a tray of broth in her hands, listening to the cough come down through 3 floors of stone, and thinking very carefully, very slowly, about the green tin under her bed. If she went up the back stair, she would be stopped. The under-butler was guarding it tonight. The Dowager Duchess had given the order herself. No servants were to disturb the gallery during the ball. If she gave the medicine to the nursery maid would not know how to administer it, and would dose by feel, and would either give too much or give it cold, and either error could kill the boy as efficiently as the fever was already trying. If she did nothing, the boy would be dead by sunrise. She had seen this cough before. She knew how many hours it had left in him. She had stood in the kitchen for a full minute with the broth tray in her hands. Then she had set it down and walked, very calmly, toward the cloakroom. She had known about the abandoned gown for an hour. She had seen the discarded mask. She had been thinking about it, in the back of her head, since 6 that evening, the way a woman thinks about an open door she had not been told to walk through. She had walked through. That was the cage and the door of it. That was beat 2 of Jenny Hollow's life. Beat 3 began on a staircase, 3 steps above the Dowager Duchess of Ravensmore, with the Duke at the foot of the stairs saying she stays. His mother turned slowly. The orgeat was still in her hand. She lifted it once and set it down on the small table near the newel post. She straightened. She looked at her son. Edmund, she said. She used his first name. It was the most dangerous thing she did all night, and not one guest in the great hall understood why. He met her eyes. She stays, he said again. He was not drunk anymore. The brandy had burned out of him in the second the boy's voice had come down the stairs. He looked suddenly like a man who had been pretending for 7 years and had stopped pretending in the last 40 seconds. He climbed the staircase. He stopped beside Jenny. He did not look at her face. He looked at her hands. He spoke quietly, so that only she could hear. You are an apothecary. She nodded once. You can help him. I can try, she said. I'm not a physician. I'm not asking for a physician, he said. Then he turned to the gallery above. He raised his voice, but only a little, because the acoustics of the great hall of Ravensmore did the work for him. The ball is concluded, he said. With my apologies. Mr. Pritchard, please see the guests to their carriages. The fault is entirely mine. The hour is late. My son is unwell. Mr. Pritchard, the steward, who had been standing at the foot of the stairs in his black coat for 40 years, bowed once and turned to the assembled guests with the smooth voice of a man putting horses into stalls. 200 people, who had been frozen on a held breath, exhaled at once. The orchestra stopped on a half bar. The Dowager Duchess did not move. She stood 3 steps below her son in violet, with the mask still in her hand, and she watched him. Then she looked at Jenny again. She did not say anything. She lifted the mask, looked at it, and set it down on the marble of the step. She left it there. She turned and walked back into the ballroom to assist Mr. Pritchard, because the Dowager Duchess of Ravensmore did not, in front of 200 witnesses, lose any battle she had not yet finished fighting. Inside her, Jenny Hollow knew the battle was very far from finished. The Duke had taken her elbow, not hard. He had turned her up the stairs. He had walked her along the gallery, past the painted Ravensmore ancestors, past the door painted pale blue, into the nursery, where a small boy lay in a wide bed with sweat on his forehead, and his small hand opening and closing on the counterpane. The boy saw her. He saw the silk. He saw the bare face above the silk. He smiled. "Jenny," he said. Then he closed his eyes. She moved very fast. She put the borrowed gown out of her way by tucking it up into her belt with 2 hands and a single twist. She washed her hands in the basin by the window, in the cold water, and she dried them on a clean linen the nursery maid produced without being asked. She took the twist of paper from her pocket. She told the Duke to send for a kettle, hot but not boiling, with a measured cup of water, and not to bother boiling it again. She told the nursery maid to bring the long pillow from the next room, so the boy could be propped up to keep his lungs from filling. She gave instructions. She did not stop to soften them. The Duke listened to every word as if she were giving him orders in his own regiment. When she said now, he moved. The Duke of Ravensmoor, in a black evening coat with a mourning band, fetched a kettle. He held a long pillow while she lifted his son. He brought a clean cup. He measured water with hands that were steadier than hers, because he had decided to be useful, and a useful man in a crisis does not allow his hands to shake. By 2 in the morning, the boy's fever had dropped a single degree. By 3, 2 degrees. By 4, his cough had loosened, and he had asked for water, and Jenny had given him a sip with a teaspoon, and the Duke had been allowed to sit at the foot of the bed. By 5, the boy was asleep, the first real sleep he had taken in 3 days. Jenny stepped back from the bed. She had not sat down in 7 hours. The borrowed gown was creased and damp under the arms. Her hair had come undone on one side. The mask was somewhere far below them on a marble step. The Duke was sitting in the chair by the foot of the bed. He had not taken off his black coat. He had not spoken in 3 hours. He was watching his son breathe. He said, without looking at her, "What is your name?" "Jenny Hollow," she said. He nodded once. He did not move. "Sit down, Miss Hollow," he said. She sat down. "In the morning," he said, "I'm going to send for a barrister, a notary, and the Bishop of Ravensbridge. By tomorrow night, you will be a married woman, if you will consent. You will be the Duchess of Ravensmoor. You will have rooms, a maid of your own, the freedom of this house, and the legal protection of my name. And you will, by virtue of that name and that title, become the mother of this child. He has no mother. He needs one. I cannot bring him one back. I can find him one. I am finding him one." He turned his head then and looked at her. "It is not a romantic offer, Miss Hollow," he said. "I want you to understand that. It is a contract. You saved my son tonight. I am offering you in return the only thing in my power to offer. A place, a name, a child who already loves you. Refuse it if you must. But consider that, if you refuse, my mother will have you out of this house by noon, and you will be on the road again with no character. You have a choice. I want you to make it with both eyes open." He spoke like a man who had been writing the contract in his head for 3 hours while he watched her work. She did not answer at once. She looked at the boy. She looked at the Duke. She looked at her own hands, which had treated a fever through the night, and which she had not been able, in 10 years, to keep from going red and split from kitchen soap. She thought of her father. She thought of his letter, folded in a tin under a bed 3 floors above them. Then she said, "Sir, you do not know me." He looked at her steadily. "I know what I have watched you do tonight," he said. "I am proposing a contract on what I have watched." She shook her head once. It cost her something to do it, because she had not shaken her head at any man with a title since she was 14. She said, with respect, "Sir, no, not tonight, not on this. You have just buried half a brandy bottle, and you have just nearly buried your son, and your mother has just stripped a woman in front of 200 guests. You are not in a state to choose a wife. You are choosing a nurse for that boy because you are frightened to lose him. I would not be the wife you took. I would be the woman you grabbed in the dark of a bad night. I will not be married for that reason, not even for a roof." She had not known she would say any of that until it was said. The Duke of Ravensmoor did not move for a long moment. She thought then that she had ruined herself a 3rd time in one night. He said, very quietly, "You are right." She stared at him. He said, "You are right that I am frightened, and you are right that I have been drinking, and you are right that I have been wanting to grab something in the dark. I have not, in 7 years, wanted very much. I have wanted to grab you. That is correctly named. Thank you for naming it." He looked at the boy. Then he looked at her again. He said, "Here is what I will do instead. I am going to send for the bishop and the notary in the morning, because the boy will recover faster with a stable household, and the only stable household I can give him by tomorrow afternoon is one in which the woman who saved his life has a name in this house. But the marriage will not be tomorrow. I will give you 3 weeks. The contract will be drawn up. You will read every line of it with the notary. You will eat at this table. You will sleep in a room in the family wing with a lock on the door and the key in your own hand. You will walk in the garden. You will see the boy whenever you want. And in 3 weeks, if you can stand the sight of me at the end of it, you will walk into the chapel of your own accord, or you will not. If you do not, you will leave this house with a character, an allowance for the rest of your life, and a closed door behind you that my mother will not open. If you do, you will be the Duchess of Ravensmoor. The choice will be yours, freely made, at the end of 3 weeks, in daylight, sober. That is my offer." She did not speak. He said, more quietly still, "Will you take the 3 weeks?" She thought of her father, of the letter, of the green tin, of 10 years of soap and silence, and of a small boy who had reached for her hand through bathwater. She thought, very clearly, "This is the day." She said yes to the 3 weeks. That was beat 3. It was a short beat, because the contract did not need words to fill it. The contract was an open door, and Jenny Hollow walked through it the second time that night. Beat 4 began with daylight. The household woke up at a slow angle. The under-housemaids were the first to be told, because the under-housemaids needed to begin moving Jenny's small box of belongings from the attic dormitory to the corner suite in the family wing, which had been Eleanor's, and which had been closed since her death. The housekeeper was told next. The housekeeper sat down on a kitchen chair and did not move for 10 minutes. The cook was told. The cook said 3 short words that cannot be repeated. Then she said, "Well, the boy lives." Then she went back to her bread. The Dowager Duchess was not told. She did not need to be told. She had been told by every step of her son's foot on the gallery the previous night. For 3 days, she did not appear at meals. For 3 days, Jenny moved through the corner suite like a woman walking on ice over deep water. The maid assigned to her, a thin girl named Sally, who had been kind to her once in the laundry 6 years ago, was the only person in the household who seemed delighted by the arrangement. Sally brushed her hair as if she had been waiting for the chance. Sally laid out 2 of Eleanor's old morning dresses, taken in for Jenny's smaller frame, and pretended not to see her cry the first time she saw herself in the long mirror. The boy was kept in his bed. Jenny visited him 3 times a day. He held her finger in his small hand and asked, on the 3rd afternoon, whether she would be staying. She told him that she would be staying. He had asked her then if she would be his mother. She had told him that she would be his Jenny, which was the truth, and his mother, which was also the truth, and that he could call her whichever felt right. He had chosen Jenny. She had not corrected him. The Duke came to the nursery twice a day. He did not come at the same times. Jenny noticed this. She thought, on the first morning, that he was avoiding her, and the thought had hurt more than she expected. By the second day she had understood that he was simply afraid to be predictable. He came twice a day, and stayed for an hour, and watched his son, and exchanged with Jenny a small handful of polite sentences, none of which referenced the night of the ball, the dance, the mask, or the marriage. The marriage contract was being drawn up in the library. The bishop was on his way. The notary had arrived on the second morning. It was on the 3rd day that they were alone for the first time. She had come down to the library at 11 in the morning because the Duke had asked her, in a brief note left under her door, whether she would be willing to sign her name to the preliminary draft. She walked in. He was alone. The notary had stepped out to walk in the garden. The library smelled of leather and beeswax, and the long windows let in a thin November sun. She stopped on the threshold. He stood up from his desk. He said, "Please come in." She came in. She sat in the chair across the desk from him. She did not look at the papers. She looked at his hands. He had ink on the side of his right hand. The signet ring on his 4th finger was loose, as if he had lost weight since he last wore it. The cuff of his white shirt was a little frayed at the edge. She found, with surprise, that she was grateful to see frayed cuffs on a man who could have afforded any cuff in England. It made him human in a way she had not been ready for. He said, "Your name." "I am sorry," she said. "I am asking what your name is," he said. "Your full name." "Hollow," you said. "Is there a middle name? Is there a maiden name?" "There will be a register. The bishop will read it." She drew a breath. "Jenny Margaret Hollow," she said. "My father was Henry Hollow. My mother was Margaret Holland." He sat very still. "Holland was your mother's name," he said. "You signed in as Holland." "Yes," she said. "Why?" he said. She thought very carefully about lying. She did not lie. "My father was Henry Hollow," she said again. "He was the apothecary of Thrushleigh. He was hanged for the poisoning of Lord Robert Carrick of Beechwood, 18 years ago this June. He did not poison him. The widow did. The widow remarried a year later, abroad, and bought a house in Provence. My father sold the digitalis and his name was on the page, and there was no money for a barrister. I was 14 when they took him. She stopped. She had not said all of that in a single breath since she was 15. The Duke had not moved. She said, "I changed my name because I did not believe the household would hire the daughter of a hanged man. They would not have. They were right not to." He said nothing. She said, "If this is the place to refuse the contract, I will understand." He stood up. He walked slowly to the long window. He looked out at the garden, where the notary was bending to look at a late rose. He spoke without turning around. "Lord Robert Carrick," he said. "Yes," she said. "He was my mother's first cousin," he said. "He was the man my mother believed was poisoned by an apothecary in Thrushleigh, 18 years ago this June. She has spoken about it, once a year, on the anniversary, for 18 years. She has not forgiven the man she believes did it, or his daughter." The room was very quiet. He turned around. "She has not," he said again, "forgiven him." Jenny stood up. She kept her hands folded in front of her. She did not weep. Not in this room. Not yet. She said, "Then I should leave today." He said no. He walked back to the desk. He put his hand on the edge of it as if to steady himself. "I am the Duke of Ravensmore," he said. "I am not my mother. I am not my dead cousin. I am a man who watched you save my son with one twist of paper and a kettle. I am also a man whose father knew Henry Hollow personally. My father bought from him. My father, who was not a sentimental man, said once at a dinner in this house that he believed Henry Hollow to be a decent and honest tradesman who had been thrown to a coroner because nobody could afford to throw a widow to one. That sentence I have remembered for 30 years. Do you understand what I am telling you, Miss Hollow?" She nodded. She did not trust her voice. "I am telling you," he said, "that the marriage will hold. I am telling you that I will protect you in this house. I am also telling you that my mother is going to spend the next week trying to break you, and the next year trying to ruin you, and you should know now what I know, which is that she will do it with everything she has, including the truth about your father. I will not hide it from you. I will not lie to you about her. I will only stand between you and her." He breathed out. "I will," he said, "be very honest with you about another thing. I do not know how to love a wife. I have not done it in 7 years. I have, in fact, gone 7 years without using the word love in a sentence about a living person. So if you take this contract, you take it knowing that. I cannot promise you a romance. I can promise you a roof, a name, my child to share, and my honest protection. If, in time, I can offer more, I will. But I will not lie at the altar." He looked at her. "Sign or do not sign," he said. "The choice is yours." She walked to the desk, picked up the pen and signed her name. Jenny Margaret Hollow. For the first time since she was 14. He looked at the name. He blinked once. He sat down. He drew the paper toward him and signed beneath her name, Edmund Charles Ravensmore. Then he reached very carefully across the desk and laid his hand on top of hers and squeezed it once, just once, and let go. It was the first time a man had touched her hand on purpose since her father. She walked out of the library without looking back and all the way up to the corner suite. She closed the door behind her, sat down on the foot of the bed, and put her hands flat on her knees, and she cried, properly, for the first time in 10 years. That was the 3rd day. The days that followed did not behave like ordinary days. They had a kind of held breath about them, as if the house were waiting to find out what kind of house it had become. The cook in the kitchen below cooked for an extra place at table and did not say a single word about it for 3 weeks, which was, in the cook's own private opinion, the largest thing she had ever done for any duke. Jenny ate her meals at the long table in the morning room, because the duke had said so, and the housekeeper had not dared argue. She sat at his right hand. The boy sat across from her with a cushion on his chair, because he was not yet quite tall enough to reach his bowl without one. The Duke did not say much at meals. He watched. He watched her lift her teacup, and he watched the boy lift a buttered carrot in a soft fist, and twice Jenny caught his eye and held it for a count of 1 and looked away first, because she could not yet decide what holding his eye was going to cost her. In the afternoons she walked in the gardens. The November light was thin and clean and good for the boy's lungs, and the boy was now strong enough to be carried short distances, and she carried him sometimes, although the gardener and the gardener's boy, and once the Duke himself, offered to carry him instead. She liked the weight of him. She had not been allowed to like the weight of anyone in a very long time. Once, on the 8th day, she had been in the South Library reading an old apothecary's manual she had asked the housekeeper to find for her, and the Duke had come in to look for a different book, and he had stopped at the door because he had not expected her to be there. He had stood looking at her for a moment too long. Then he had said, in a voice as level as he could make it, "Please do not let me interrupt you," and he had walked to the shelves and pulled down a book and walked out again without looking at her face. She had not been able to read another word for half an hour. That had been a warm day. The next morning he had passed her in the corridor outside the nursery and had looked through her as if she were not there at all. He had not greeted her. He had not slowed. He had walked on, and she had stood for a moment with her hand on the wall, and she had thought, with surprise, that the cold had hurt her more than she had expected. That had been a cold day. It went like this for 3 weeks. Warm, cold, with a faint upward tilt to it, the way water rises in a kettle that has been put on a slow flame. She did not, in any of those days, ask him what he was doing. She had her own work. She had taken charge of the nursery with the housekeeper's consent and Mrs. Penny's grateful and resentful permission. She had taught the head housemaid how to test for the early sound of a wet cough. She had drawn up a list of medicines to be kept in a locked cupboard in the nursery wing, and the Duke had signed for the cost without looking at the list. Once, in the 2nd week, the boy had got a small fever in the night, a thing of no consequence, the kind of fever a healthy child runs when he is growing. She had been in the nursery before the nursery maid had finished calling for her. The Duke had been there too, in his shirt sleeves, with his hair undone. They had stood on either side of the bed in the dim lamplight, and the boy had reached for both of their hands at once and held them, one in each small fist, and gone back to sleep without seeing either of them. They had not spoken. They had only sat there, with the boy holding them, and after a while the Duke had said, in a voice so low she almost missed it, "This is what it would have been with Marcus." She had not answered, because an answer was not what he had wanted. She had only let her hand stay where it was, with the boy's small fingers wrapped around her thumb and the Duke's hand on the other side, until the dawn began to come up. That had been the warmest day. By the 3rd week, the lock and key the Duke had promised her on the door of her room were still there, but she had stopped using them. She had stopped without deciding to. Sally had noticed. The housekeeper had noticed. The Duke, who noticed everything, had said nothing, because saying anything would have undone it. On the Saturday of the 3rd week she went into the chapel alone, before the household woke. She walked the aisle from the door to the altar. She stood at the altar rail in her grey wool morning dress, with her hair in the plain knot Sally had taught her to do for herself, and she said aloud, to the empty chapel, "I am choosing this with both eyes open. I am 24 years old. I have read the contract. I am not being grabbed in the dark. I am choosing." The chapel did not answer. She had not expected it to. She had only wanted to say it, where she could hear herself say it. She walked out. She went to the Duke's study and told him, in 3 sentences, that she would be in the chapel on Tuesday at 11. He set his pen down on the blotter very carefully, as a man sets down a glass he does not want to spill. He said, "Thank you, Duchess," she said. "Not yet." He smiled a very small smile and corrected himself. He said, "Thank you, Miss Hollow." She said, "That is also not quite right." He looked up. She said, "My name is Jenny." He said it. He said, "Thank you, Jenny." She walked out of the study and did not stop walking until she was in the garden, and once there she put her hand against the trunk of an old apple tree, because her knees had decided, without consulting her, that they were not entirely reliable. That was the last day of the warm-cold pattern. After it the cold did not come back. The warm only deepened. The Dowager Duchess, on the floor below them, did not notice any of this. She was busy with her own letters in violet wax. She had been writing to a small chapel in Devon, and to a parish in Yorkshire, and to a clerk in a courthouse outside Bristol. She had been gathering, by post and by patience, the kind of ammunition that does not show its shape until it is fired. She would have it ready by the night of the wedding. She would not use it until weeks later, when the hall had grown comfortable enough to be wounded. The wedding was quiet. It was held in the small chapel at the east end of Ravensmoor, on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the ball. The bishop performed it. Mr. Pritchard, the steward, stood as a witness, in a black coat, with the dignity of a man who knew the institution he served was older than any single duchess. Sally stood as the second witness, weeping openly. The Dowager Duchess did not attend. Thomas was carried in by his father. He was thin and pale, but he was upright. He held a single late rose. When the bishop asked who gave this woman to be married, the boy said, in a clear voice that surprised everyone in the chapel, including himself, "I do." The Duke looked down at his son. The Duke smiled. It was the first smile the steward had seen on his master's face in 7 years. The steward later told the cook about it, in confidence, and the cook had to sit down again. Jenny said her vows in a steady voice. The Duke said his without hesitation. He did not say the word love, because he had told her he would not lie at the altar. He said instead that he would honour, keep, and protect her before God and before this household until his last breath. She understood, in that moment, that he had given her a more honest vow than most brides receive. She wore the green silk. She had repaired the loose ribbon herself, by candlelight, 3 nights earlier. She had told Sally simply that the dress had been with her the first time her life had changed, and it ought to be with her the second time too. After the chapel, there was a small breakfast in the morning room. The boy ate buttered carrots. The Duke drank 1 glass of wine. The bishop ate too much trifle. The Dowager Duchess did not come down. A tray was sent up to her. The tray came back untouched. For 9 days after the wedding, the Dowager Duchess remained in her rooms. The household began to believe that she had retreated. Sally, brushing Jenny's hair on the 8th night, said, "She has gone to ground, my lady. She will come out when she has decided what shape she wants to come out in." On the 10th morning, she came out. Beat 5 began at 9:30 in the breakfast room, on a Thursday, with the Dowager Duchess walking through the door as if she had been coming to breakfast every morning for a month. "Good morning," she said. Jenny stood up. The Duke stood up. The boy, who was being fed toast soldiers at a small table by the window, did not stand up because he did not know he had to. The Dowager Duchess walked to the head of the table and sat down. She picked up the teapot, poured tea for herself, and set the pot down again with the small click of a woman placing a piece on a board. She looked mildly at Jenny. "I have come to apologize," she said. Jenny did not speak. The Duke did not speak. "I behaved badly," the Dowager Duchess said, on the night of the ball. I had not been informed of my grandson's illness in any proper detail. I had not been informed that the physician had declined to come. I had not been informed that one of our household staff had medical training. I was, in short, ignorant of several material facts, and in my ignorance I performed an action that I now regret. I removed a mask. I named a woman as a kitchen rat. I owe that woman my grandson's life, and I owe her the apology I'm offering now. She lifted her teacup. She drank. She set it down. She looked at Jenny. "I would like," she said, "to be introduced. Properly. Edmund, will you do the honours?" The Duke looked at his mother for a long, silent count of 4. Then he said, with very careful courtesy, "Mother, may I present my wife, Jenny Margaret Ravensmore, Duchess of Ravensmore. Jenny, my mother, the Dowager Duchess of Ravensmore." Jenny curtsied. The Dowager Duchess inclined her head. "Welcome to this household, Duchess," the Dowager Duchess said. "I am honoured, madam," Jenny said. The Duke watched both of them. Jenny could see in the side of his jaw that he did not believe a word of any of it. Neither did she. But the Dowager Duchess ate 2 pieces of toast, drank her tea, and went to look at the gardens. And for several days she did not strike. On the Wednesday afternoon, Mr. Pritchard came to the Duke's study with a small parcel wrapped in oilskin. It had been sent down from London by an old family solicitor who had retired 10 years earlier, and who had, on the day of his retirement, locked a particular folder of correspondence in his own personal safe, because he had not been comfortable with what was in it. Mr. Pritchard had written to him at the Duke's request the morning after the masked ball. The solicitor had answered within the week. He had asked only that, if the contents were ever used, the source not be named while he was alive, because the source was 83 years old and still afraid of one Dowager Duchess in particular. The Duke read what was in the parcel over the next 4 hours. He drank 2 glasses of water and no brandy. When he had finished, he locked the parcel in the 3rd drawer of his desk, turned the key in his pocket, and went to find his son. He did not speak to anyone, not even his wife, for the rest of that afternoon. He sat in the nursery with the boy on his lap, and watched the boy fall asleep on his shoulder, and he thought about a great many things, none of which he said aloud. He had the ammunition now. He had decided not to use it yet, because the petition to the crown would carry better in March if his mother had not been publicly humiliated first. He had decided to spare her that, for his late father's sake, more than for hers. His mother forced the timing herself, 4 days later. On the Friday night before that, Sally told Jenny that she had seen the Dowager Duchess in the long gallery at 1 a.m, standing in front of the portrait of her dead son Marcus, with a small folded handkerchief held against her mouth. The Dowager Duchess had not been weeping in any loud way because Dowager Duchesses do not weep loudly. She had only been standing there. Sally had not moved. The Dowager Duchess had stood for nearly an hour, until the candle in the gallery was nearly out, and then she had put her hand once on the painted hem of her son's coat in the picture, very lightly, the way a woman might touch a child she was no longer allowed to touch in the body. Then she had walked back to her own room without seeing Sally at all. Jenny thought about that for a long time. She did not change her mind about anything that mattered, but she understood after that the woman who had ripped a mask off her face had been carrying her own dead boy in her pocket for 7 years, and that some grief turns inward the way some wounds do, and rots, and produces a kind of person that the world does not know how to forgive. Then on Sunday, the Dowager struck. The strike was a dinner. The Dowager Duchess hosted a small Sunday dinner in her own private dining room on the first floor, which she had not used in 5 years. She invited the Bishop of Ravensbridge. She invited 2 county families, the Marleys and the Heatherfords. She invited a man named Mr. John Carrick, who was the grown nephew of the late Lord Robert Carrick, who was 28 years old, who had inherited Beechwood from his uncle's widow when she died abroad 2 years previously, who was unmarried, and who had been corresponding politely with the Dowager Duchess for the last several months on the subject of a particular old grievance. She also invited her son and his new wife. Jenny dressed for dinner that evening with hands that did not shake, because she had decided at 24 that her hands would not shake in this house for any reason short of fever. Sally brushed her hair. Sally laid out the deep blue silk Eleanor had worn for her last Christmas. Sally pinned the small sapphire combs that had been Eleanor's. Jenny looked at herself in the mirror and saw a stranger in a borrowed face, and reminded herself, sharply, that the face was now hers, by signature, by bishop, and by vow. The Duke met her on the landing. He looked at her. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he offered his arm. "You are afraid?" he said, very quietly. "Yes," she said. "So am I," he said. "We will be afraid together. Now smile, please, because we are about to walk into a room full of my mother's friends, and I would rather not give them the satisfaction." She smiled. It was not a real smile. It was, however, a good one. The dinner began with soup. It progressed through fish and a roast. It progressed through wine. The bishop spoke about Lent. The Marleys spoke about hunting. Mr. Carrick spoke about the running of Beechwood, which he had inherited and was attempting to restore. The Dowager Duchess listened, smiled, refilled her glass once and waited. She struck between the meat and the pudding. She set down her fork. "Mr. Carrick," she said, "I was hoping to ask your opinion on a small matter of family history. Forgive me. This is a question for which I owe my own son an answer too. I do not raise it lightly." The bishop looked up. Mr. Carrick, who was a thin young man with a long jaw, not unlike his uncle's, set down his glass politely. "By all means, Dowager," he said. The Dowager Duchess turned slightly in her chair. She faced down the table. She looked, with mild courtesy, at her daughter-in-law. "Jenny, my dear," she said, "I have only this week obtained, through a very kind clerk in Devon, a copy of a court record from 18 years ago, the trial of an apothecary named Henry Hollow, accused of selling the digitalis tincture that killed Lord Robert Carrick of Beechwood. The man pleaded innocent. He was hanged. The court record contains the name of his daughter, who was 14 at the time of the trial. The daughter's name is, I am told, Jenny Margaret Hollow. She lifted her teacup. She did not drink from it. She lowered it again. I would like to ask you, my dear, whether that is, in fact, your name." The table was very quiet. The bishop set down his fork. The Marleys looked at their plates. Mrs. Heatherford pressed her lips together. Mr. Carrick looked for the first time at Jenny with a great deal of interest. Jenny stood up. She did not stand up to flee. She stood up because her father had taught her, when she was 9, that an apothecary stood when he gave testimony. She stood because she had decided, in that exact second, that the Dowager Duchess of Ravensmoor was not going to receive her answer sitting down. "It is," she said. The room exhaled. The Dowager Duchess smiled faintly. She let the silence run for 2 long seconds. Then she opened her mouth to deliver the rest of the strike. The Duke spoke first. He did not stand. He did not raise his voice. He turned his head and looked at his mother, and he spoke as if there were no one else in the room. "Mother," he said, "I am aware of my wife's father. I have been aware since the 3rd day after the masked ball. I made the decision to marry her with full knowledge of the matter. I made it because, having read my late father's own correspondence on the case, I am persuaded that Henry Hollow was hanged for a crime he did not commit, and that this household, in its public silence at the time, was complicit. I intend to repair that silence. I intend to apply to the Crown for a posthumous pardon. I intend, with my wife's permission, to fund the application out of my own estate. I will tell you this now, in front of these witnesses, because I will not allow you to wield the matter as a weapon over my wife at any dinner table, including yours." He paused. He turned to Mr. Carrick. "Sir," he said, "I do not believe your uncle was killed by Henry Hollow. I believe he was killed by his wife, the wife who fled to France, the wife who, by your own family lawyer's correspondence, my mother knows, has been receiving an allowance from the Carrick estate via a third party for the last 14 years. An allowance she has no legal claim to, an allowance my mother arranged." The bishop dropped his fork. Mrs. Heatherford gasped. Mrs. Marley stared into her wineglass. The Dowager Duchess's face did not change, but her hand, which had been resting on the table beside her teacup, closed slowly into a fist. "Edmund," she said. "I have the letters, mother," he said. "I have had them since Wednesday. I had been hoping not to use them at a dinner table at all. You have forced my hand." He turned to his wife. "Sit down, Duchess," he said gently. Jenny sat down. The Dowager Duchess did not move for a full minute. She looked at her son. She did not look at Jenny. She picked up her napkin, folded it once and set it on the table. "Edmund," she said, "I would like to retire." "Of course, mother," he said. "Mr. Pritchard will see you up." Mr. Pritchard, who had been standing at the sideboard for 40 years, stepped forward. The Dowager Duchess of Ravensmoor stood. She walked with perfect dignity the length of the dining room, and out of the door, and into a corridor where 10 paces down, her own maid said later that she stopped, put one gloved hand on the wall and stood there for a full half-minute before walking on. She did not come down to breakfast for 2 weeks. When the door had closed, the bishop cleared his throat. The Marleys looked at their plates. Mr. Carrick set down his glass, very slowly, and turned to Jenny. "Mrs. Ravensmoor," he said, "I should like, with your permission, to read the letters your husband has spoken of. I should like to do so before I leave this house. If, after reading them, I am persuaded as he is, I will join your husband's application to the Crown. Whatever my family has done, or my aunt has done, I will not, by silence, do again. I am told I look like my uncle. I would prefer not to act like him." The Duke lifted his glass. "Mr. Carrick," he said, "you honour your name." Mr. Carrick lifted his glass back. "To the truth," he said. The bishop, who had been silent in disbelief, lifted his glass. "To the truth," he said. Mr. Marley and Mr. Heatherford and their wives lifted their glasses one by one. Each of them said the same words. "To the truth." Jenny lifted her glass. Her hand did not shake. Her eyes did fill with water, although she did not allow any of it to fall in the dining room. "To my father," she said. The Duke turned then and looked at her across the table. He did not smile. He looked instead as if he had been waiting his whole life for this moment to land on him, and it had landed, and he was steady under it. "To Henry Hollow," he said. 6 glasses lifted, including her own. That was beat 5. The reveal was not who Jenny was. The reveal, as it turned out, was who the Dowager Duchess had been all along. Beat 6 did not begin that week. Beat 6 began nearly a month later, at 11:30 on a snowing night in early January, in the upper gallery of Ravensmoor. December had passed slowly. The Dowager Duchess had kept to her rooms. Mr. Carrick had stayed on for 2 weeks, reading the letters under the bishop's supervision, then had gone home to Beechwood to write his own application to the Crown in support of the petition. The bishop had taken the Henry Hollow file with him to Ravensbridge to begin drafting the formal application. The petition would be heard, the bishop had said, no sooner than March, and possibly not until April. There would be a hearing. There would be witnesses. There would, the bishop had warned, be one more attempt by the Dowager Duchess to muddy the county's opinion before the Crown made its decision. For most of December, the hall settled into its first quiet weeks. The boy grew an inch and a half. He learned to read 3 new words, and one of them was apothecary, which he had asked Jenny to spell for him from the front of one of her father's notebooks. The Duke read with the boy on his lap most evenings, after supper, in the smaller drawing room. Jenny sat in the chair across from them with a piece of embroidery she did not entirely know how to do, watching them, learning to allow herself to be sitting in a room with 2 people she loved without expecting the door to open and the household to come for her. On the night beat 6 began, Jenny had walked out of the nursery, where the boy was now sleeping a clean sleep, and she had not been able to make herself walk back to her own room. She had walked instead the length of the gallery, past the painted Ravensmoors, past the Eleanor portrait, past the small door that led to the South Library, and into the South Library itself, because she had remembered, in passing, that the South Library had a window seat that looked out at the snow. She had sat in the window seat without lighting a lamp. She had thought, for the first time in many weeks, about what would happen now, about the application to the Crown, about her father's name on a piece of paper somewhere in the bishop's study, about the Dowager Duchess in her room above them, about the boy, about the man she had married. She had thought all of these things in the dark, and then a door opened on the other side of the library, and a footstep came in. The Duke had been looking for her. He did not switch on a lamp either. He came down the long room, past the shelves, and stopped at the window seat. He did not sit because he had not been asked. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "I did not wish to startle you." "You did not," she said. "May I sit?" he said. "Yes," she said. He sat. The window seat was not large. They were not touching. The snow came down outside and made the room very faintly blue. They were both quiet for a long time. He spoke first. "I owe you an apology," he said. "For what?" she said. "For the dinner," he said. "I had not intended to tell you about my mother's correspondence at that table. I had planned to tell you privately, the following morning." She forced my hand. "I am sorry that you learned of it in front of witnesses." "You saved me," she said. "I did not save you," he said. "You saved my son." He looked out at the snow. He said, very quietly, "May I tell you about my brother?" "Yes," she said. He told her. He told her about Marcus, who had been 3 years younger, and who had laughed too loudly at funerals, and who had taught Edmund to swim in the carp pond when they were boys, and who had got a fever in November, 7 years and 1 week ago, the same fever that had nearly taken Thomas. He told her that the physician had been Dr. Crail even then, and that Dr. Crail had taken 11 days to arrive, and that by the 11th day there had been no point. He told her that he had sat by Marcus's bed for the last 3 days of his life, and that he had done nothing useful because he had not known what to do, and that he had heard in the last hour the same wet rising cough that he had heard in his son's chest 2 weeks ago. He told her that he had not forgiven himself. He told her that, when he heard his son cough that way the first time, he had gone into his own dressing room and stood with his hand on the back of a chair and shaken so hard he could not button his cuffs. He told her that when he had seen her at the foot of the staircase, with the twist of paper in her pocket and the medicine in her hand, he had not been seeing her. He had been seeing the thing he had failed to do for Marcus, walking past him in a green dress. He told her that he had been afraid of her ever since. He told her that he had not been afraid of her because she was a kitchen maid. He had been afraid of her because she had done in one night what he had been unable to do in 7 years. He told her, last of all, in a voice she had to lean closer to hear, that he was tired of being afraid. He did not look at her while he spoke. He looked at the snow. When he finished, she did not speak at once. She let his words live in the air for a few seconds, because the words were old and large and deserved their space. Then she said, very quietly, "My father wrote me a letter the night before he was hanged." He turned his head. "I have it still," she said. "I have read it twice a year for 10 years. It told me that I had been raised to be useful, that the world would try to take that from me, and that one day, if I lived long enough, I would have the chance to use what he had taught me to save someone who deserved saving. I've carried that letter for 10 years and not believed it. I believed it for the first time the night I crossed the ballroom. I believed it because of your son. I want you to know, sir, that what your brother died of is not what your son will die of. Because of what your brother died of, your son will live. Do you understand? The death taught the cure. The cure is in this house now. It is sitting in this window seat with you. It will not leave. He sat very still. He said her name. Jenny, he said. She did not answer. She let her name be said. He lifted his hand. He did not touch her face. He touched the back of her hand on the window seat between them. He laid his palm flat over her knuckles. He did not press. She did not move her hand away. I do not know how to love a wife, he said. I told you that in the library. I am telling you now that I know how to learn. I am telling you now that, if you can be patient, I will learn. She turned her hand. Their palms touched. Her fingers closed around his. We will both learn, she said. They sat in the window seat for a long time. He said, finally, my mother will not be done. You know that. I know, she said. She is preparing one more strike, he said. I think it will come at the Candlemas Gala. The house is open then. The county comes. She will not let it pass without one more attempt. What can she do? Jenny said. You have the letters. She can do, he said, what she has been doing for 30 years. She can change the story. She can plant a different story in the county before the Crown receives the petition. She can ruin the petition without ever speaking my brother's name. I know my mother. I have lived with her for 35 years. Then we will be ready, she said. We, he said. We, she said. He smiled. It was the second smile the household had seen on his face in 7 years. It was not for the steward this time. It was for her. He stood up. He did not let go of her hand. He drew her to her feet. He drew her slowly across the dark library to the door. He stopped at the door. He said, May I kiss you, Duchess? She lifted her face. You may, she said. He kissed her once, on the forehead, very gently, like a man putting his hand against a stove to test whether it was still warm. It was warm. He walked her back to her room. He bowed at her door, said good night, and did not come in. She closed the door and leaned against it, and she thought, for the first time in 10 years, that she was not alone in this house. That was beat 6. The cage was opening on its second hinge. Whatever the Dowager Duchess was planning, the wall between Jenny and the Duke was no longer a wall. It was a door. It was open. The Candlemas Gala at Ravensmoor was the second largest event in the county calendar. It happened in the first week of February every year, in the great hall and the long dining room, and the county came whether or not they were on speaking terms with one another, because to skip the Ravensmoor Gala was to admit to a feud, and county families did not admit to feuds in writing. This year, the county was coming for a different reason. They were coming to look at the new Duchess. The story had spread. The story of the masked ball. The story of the dance. The story of the mask removed on the staircase. The story of the boy's voice calling down. The story of the Dowager Duchess's dinner. The story of the toast. The story of the rumoured petition to the Crown. By the last week of January, the story had reached every drawing room within 60 miles, and it had reached them in 8 different versions, some of them more accurate than others. The gala would be the first time the county could see Jenny. The Dowager Duchess had not come down to dinner in more than a month, but on the morning of the gala she came down to breakfast. She wore lilac. She greeted the Duke politely, then Jenny politely. She drank her tea and returned to her rooms. Sally, brushing Jenny's hair that afternoon, said, My lady, she is going to do something tonight. I know, Jenny said. What can we do? Sally said. We can be ready, Jenny said. Bring me the small green tin from the dressing table. Sally brought it. Jenny opened it. She took out 3 small folded papers. Each paper was about the size of a playing card. Each paper contained a small twist of dried leaf. She closed the tin. She put the 3 papers, very carefully, into the sewn pocket on the underside of her gown. Beat 7 began at 9:30 in the Great Hall of Ravensmoor, with 240 guests, a string quartet, and the largest collection of county eyes Jenny Hollow had ever stood under. She walked in on the Duke's arm. She wore the green silk again. She had repaired it for the second time. The bishop had advised it. The county, he had said, would understand the symbol. The county did understand. The hall went quiet for a moment when she walked in. Then a small, slow ripple of applause, started by Mr. Carrick at the foot of the stairs, ran through the room. The Dowager Duchess stood at the side of the room in lilac. She did not applaud. She did not need to. She watched. The dinner was elaborate. The dancing began at 11. Jenny danced once with her husband, once with Mr. Carrick, and once with the bishop, who was an awful dancer but a kind one. She did not dance with Mr. Marley. She did not dance with Mr. Heatherford. She did not dance with anyone the Dowager Duchess might have planted in the room. At midnight, the Dowager Duchess struck. She did not strike through Mr. Carrick. Mr. Carrick, she had finally understood, was on the wrong side. She struck instead through a thin woman in maroon who had arrived from London that morning, an old friend of hers from her own girlhood, a Lady Stoke, who had once been mistress of a small estate in Yorkshire, and who had, some years ago, hired a kitchen maid named Jane Hollow on the recommendation of a parish in Bristol, and who had dismissed her 6 months later for the theft of a silver spoon. This was not true. Jenny had never been to Yorkshire. Jenny had never been within 100 miles of Lady Stoke's estate, but Lady Stoke's testimony, given at a county gala in front of 240 witnesses, would be very difficult to dispute. The Dowager Duchess walked Lady Stoke into the great hall on her arm. The string quartet stopped between numbers. Lady Stoke, the Dowager Duchess said, in her clearest voice, has just arrived from London. I was hoping she might be persuaded to share with our new Duchess a small piece of her own history. Lady Stoke, my dear, would you be so kind? Lady Stoke smiled. Of course, she said. The hall went still in that particular way it had a habit of going still in this house. Lady Stoke began. It was a careful story. She had once, she said, hired a young woman by the name of Jane Hollow. The young woman had come with a parish reference from Bristol. The young woman had been an excellent worker, but at the end of 6 months a silver spoon had gone missing. The spoon had been found in the young woman's box. The young woman had been dismissed without character. Lady Stoke paused. She looked with very polite curiosity at Jenny. I had no idea, she said, that Lady Ravensmore might be the same person. I am, of course, prepared to be entirely wrong. The Dowager Duchess smiled. 240 pairs of eyes turned to Jenny. The Duke moved 1 step forward to stand beside her. Mr. Carrick moved 1 step forward on her other side. The bishop, at the side of the room, set down his glass. Jenny did not move. She thought, very calmly, that this was the moment she had been raised for. She lifted her chin slightly. She let the silence run for 2 full seconds. She did not let it run a third because she had learned on a staircase a month ago that letting a silence run too long was a kind of surrender. She said, in a perfectly clear voice, Lady Stoke, you are wrong. The room exhaled. She continued. I have, she said, never been to Yorkshire. I have never been employed by you. I have never been employed under any name other than the one on the indenture I signed at 14, in this hall, at the kitchen door. That name was Jenny Holland, taken from my mother's family. The housekeeper has held the indenture in her own book for 10 years. Mr. Pritchard, will you fetch it? Mr. Pritchard, who had been waiting for this question for an hour, said, My lady, I have it here. He produced it. The bishop, who had been standing by the side of the room because Jenny and the Duke had asked him in advance, stepped forward and read the indenture aloud. The date of indenture, the signature, the address, the years of service, the unblemished record, 10 years of unblemished record, the character reference of the housekeeper. 240 pairs of eyes followed every word. When the bishop finished, the hall waited. Jenny did not stop. She said, Lady Stoke, I have one more question for you. Will you be so kind as to describe the silver spoon you have spoken of? Lady Stoke blinked. The silver spoon, Jenny said. You said it was found in the young woman's box. I am asking you to describe it. The pattern, the maker, the weight, the marks. Lady Stoke had not prepared for this question. The pause stretched. It was the kind of pause that, in a room of 240 people, becomes its own kind of evidence. The bishop did not move. Mr. Carrick did not move. The string quartet, which had not yet been told to start again, did not move either. 240 people had been to enough dinner parties in their lives to know what a guilty silence sounded like, and the silence of Lady Stoke at that moment was the loudest one most of them had ever heard. She said, at last, I do not recall. Jenny did not move. Inside her chest, behind her steady face, Her heart was doing the same drag and knock it had done on the night she had first walked into that ballroom in a borrowed gown. She was 24 years old. She had been a kitchen maid in this house for 10 of those years. She had peeled potatoes by the light of a single tallow candle. She had been called a rat on this very staircase 3 months ago, and now she was standing in green silk in front of 240 witnesses, asking an old friend of her mother-in-law to describe a spoon. The cost of the moment landed on her all at once. Her hand wanted to shake. She did not let it. Her father had stood when he gave testimony. So would she. She said with deliberate quiet, "You do not recall the spoon that destroyed a young woman's reference 12 years ago. The spoon was reported. The spoon was inventoried. There would be a household ledger. Lady Stoke, the question is not a trick. I'm asking you to describe a spoon." The hall waited. A woman in the gallery above coughed once, then put a gloved hand against her mouth as if she had betrayed something. Mrs. Heatherford, in the third row of guests, lowered her eyes to her shoes. Mr. Marley, who had been a magistrate for 22 years, set his glass down on the rim of a side table with the small intentional sound a man makes when he has stopped being a guest and started being a witness. Lady Stoke did not answer. Jenny turned very slowly to the Dowager Duchess. "Madam," she said, "I think Lady Stoke has been imposed upon. I do not think she has lied to this gathering on purpose. I think she has been provided with a story she did not have time to verify. I think the person who provided her with the story is the person who walked her into this room on her arm." The Dowager Duchess's hand closed around the head of her cane. Jenny continued. She had decided, in advance, with her husband, and with the bishop and with Mr. Carrick, that she would deliver the kill shot herself. Her husband had agreed. He had told her, in the South Library 3 nights earlier, that the line should be hers, because the wound had been hers, and the line that closes a wound belongs to the woman who carries it. She delivered it now. She did not raise her voice. "Madam," she said, "you ordered the silver spoon story this week. You ordered it from a friend of your girlhood. You ordered it because your son's petition to the Crown will be heard in March. You wanted to ruin the petitioner before the Crown could hear her. You have, I am sorry to say, been doing this kind of thing for a very long time. Mr. Carrick, will you read?" Mr. Carrick read. He read the letters from the Dowager Duchess to a small parish in Yorkshire 6 weeks earlier, the letters from the Dowager Duchess to Lady Stoke 3 weeks earlier, the letters from the Dowager Duchess to the same third party who had been forwarding an allowance to the late Lord Robert Carrick's widow in France for 14 years, the letters his uncle's family lawyer had been keeping in a locked drawer since the year of the trial, because the lawyer had never been comfortable with the verdict and had been waiting his whole career for someone to ask him about it. The letters were read in full. 240 pairs of eyes did not blink. When Mr. Carrick finished, the hall was so quiet that Jenny could hear the snow against the windows. The Dowager Duchess stood very still. She did not deny it. She could not. The letters were in her own hand. The bishop confirmed it. Mr. Pritchard confirmed it. The housekeeper, who had been called for and had arrived in the middle of the reading, confirmed it. The Dowager Duchess looked finally at her son. He said, "Mother, I am asking you to retire from this house. Tomorrow morning. You will be provided with the dower house at Greythorne. You will be provided with an income suitable to your station. You will not return to Ravensmoor without my written permission. You will not communicate with the county on the subject of this household. You will not communicate with Lady Stoke. You will not communicate, in any form, with the Crown's office that will hear our petition in March. If you do, I will publish the letters. If you obey, I will not. The choice is yours." The Dowager Duchess looked at her son for a long moment. She looked at Jenny. She did not look at Mr. Carrick. She inclined her head half an inch. She turned with perfect dignity and walked the length of the great hall. 240 pairs of eyes followed her. She walked out. She did not return. The bishop stepped forward. He lifted his glass. He said, "My lord, my lady, ladies and gentlemen, I should like to offer a toast to the late Henry Hollow of Thrushleigh, who was wronged by a court 18 years ago, and whose name, by the grace of God and the diligence of his daughter, will be restored in March. To his daughter, to this household, 240 glasses lifted. To Henry Hollow, the hall said. To Henry Hollow, Jenny said. She did not weep in the great hall. She wept properly on the staircase 15 minutes later on her husband's shoulder after he had walked her out of the room. He held her there for a long time. He said into her hair, "You delivered that, Duchess. You did. Not me. You." "I had help," she said. "You had help," he said, "because you were finally surrounded by people who recognized what you were. You did the rest. Your father would be proud of you." She lifted her face. He kissed her, not on the forehead this time, on the mouth, very gently, as if she were a thing he had been allowed at last to touch on purpose. That was beat 7, the false climax, the public victory, the villain destroyed, the county watching, the petition cleared, the kitchen rat in her daughter-in-law's dress standing on the great staircase of Ravensmoor with the Duke's arm around her, and the bishop calling her by her father's name. Beat 8 began at the South Library window seat, that same night, after midnight, after the county had gone home and the household had gone to bed. The Duke had brought her there with one candle and a folded blanket. They had not spoken on the way. They had not needed to. He set the candle down. He set the blanket on the window seat. He sat down. He did not pat the seat beside him. He simply waited. She sat. He took her hand. He said, "I have something to say to you, in private without witnesses, that I have not said in this house in 7 years." She did not speak. "I love you, Jenny Margaret Ravensmoor," he said. "I love you. I have loved you since the night you crossed the ballroom and asked me for nothing. I love the way you stood on the staircase tonight with your hands empty. I love the way you bathed my son this morning because you said it was a Tuesday, and Tuesday is bath day. I love the silence in you, which is not the silence of a woman who has nothing to say, but the silence of a woman who has decided what to say. I love you. I will say it again tomorrow. I will say it every day, in private, for the rest of my life. I will say it in public when you let me. I will not say it in public if you would rather I did not. The choice is yours. I am, finally, in private, telling you, I love you." She did not answer at once. She had not been told those words by any person who said them and meant them since she was 14. Her father had said them on the night before they came for him, in the letter she still kept in a tin under her own dressing table. Her mother had said them earlier, when her mother had still been alive. Nobody had said them in the 10 years between. Those 2 words had been kept on a high shelf inside her chest for the whole of her grown life, and the shelf had grown very dusty, and the words themselves had grown very heavy when she went, just then, to lift them down. She did not lift them down all at once. She lifted them down by their corners. She put her free hand on the side of his face. It was the first time she had touched his face on purpose. He had a small scar on his jaw she had not noticed by daylight, the kind of scar a boy gets from falling on stone. She pressed her thumb against it, gently, as if to make sure he was a real thing and not something she had begun to imagine in the dark of the South Library. She felt the tears come. She did not try to stop them. They were not the public kind. They were the slow, private kind that mean a person has finally come home and is allowed to put her bag down. She said, very quietly, "I love you, Edmund Charles Ravensmoor. I have loved you since the moment you said she stays. I had not known then what to call it. I have known for some weeks now. I have been afraid to say it. I am saying it." She breathed out. The breath went all the way down. It went into a place inside her chest that had not been breathed into in 10 years. He did not speak. He did not need to. He lifted his other hand and laid it over hers on his face, and held it there, and he closed his eyes, the way a man closes his eyes when he has been told at last, the only thing he has been wanting to be told. Then he pulled her against his chest very gently. She put her face into the wool of his coat. They sat that way for a long time in the South Library, with one small candle between them, and a snowfall outside heavy enough to bury the carriage tracks on the drive. That was the true climax. There were no witnesses. The candle was very small. The snow outside the South Library window was very heavy. The Dowager Duchess, in a carriage on the road to the Dower House at Greythorne, did not see it. The county, in their beds across 40 miles, did not see it. Mr. Pritchard, asleep at last for the first time in a week, did not see it. The only witness was the candle, and the candle was not the sort that talked. The petition was granted in March. Henry Hollow's name was restored. The Dowager Duchess never set foot in Ravensmoor again. She wrote once in May to ask if she might visit her grandson. The Duke wrote back politely that she would be welcome to visit her grandson at Greythorn whenever the boy chose to be brought to her. The boy did not choose to be brought that year, or the next year, or any year after. He was a kind boy. He was not a foolish one. Jenny went on bathing him every Tuesday, until the Tuesday he turned 10 and informed her, with great gravity, that he could bathe himself. She had laughed and let him. He had then, with even greater gravity, asked her to brush his hair instead, because he liked the brushing, and the brushing he intended to keep. She had brushed his hair on Tuesdays for the next 8 years. When Thomas was 12, he had a real painter sent up to the nursery to touch up the painted ceiling, because his mother Eleanor's brushwork had begun to flake in places. He had given the painter one strict instruction. Eleanor's clumsy hand was to be kept visible underneath everything new, because the ceiling was hers and would always be hers. He had given the painter one other instruction. Orion's belt was to be moved across the room, very carefully to sit beside the bull where it belonged. He had not told Jenny he had done it. He had let her discover it the next morning when she came in to wake him. She had looked up at the ceiling for a long time without saying anything, and then she had looked at the boy, who was not a small boy anymore, and they had understood each other without saying a word. She also became, on the side, the apothecary of Ravensmoor. She kept the old green tin under her own dressing table. She compounded for the household. She compounded for the village. She refused, politely, to charge for any of it, because she said the bill had been paid by her father in another century. The village paid her in eggs, in bread, in a slow rebuilding of the name Hollow that her husband had begun and that the village finished. 6 years after the gala, the Duke and Duchess of Ravensmoor had a daughter. They named her Margaret, after Jenny's mother. The child had grey eyes like her father, and a stubborn jaw like her brother, and an unreasonable fondness for buttered carrots that her brother had absolutely taught her. 3 years after that, they had a son. They named him Henry. The boy Henry asked once when he was 4 why his father always cried a little when he said his name. Jenny told him. She told him about her father, about the apothecary's shop above the parlour, about the small notebook in his hand, about the willow bark, about the green silk, about the night she had crossed a ballroom in a borrowed mask. She told him the whole story. He listened. He said, at the end, "Mamma, were you afraid?" "Yes," she said. "But you went anyway," he said. "Yes," she said. He nodded. He was 4. He understood in the way that 4-year-olds understand, which is the only honest way anyone understands anything. He said, "I am glad." She said, "So am I." On the night of the 20th anniversary of the masked ball, the Duke and Duchess of Ravensmoor walked alone the length of the gallery. They stopped at the head of the main staircase. They stood for a few minutes at the place where, 20 years before, a dowager had ripped a mask off a kitchen maid's face and called her a rat in front of 200 guests. The Duke looked at his wife. He said, "Do you ever think of it?" "Every November," she said. He said, "What do you think?" She said, "I think I was waiting. For the first 14 years of my life I was being taught. For the next 10 years I was waiting. The night your mother ripped that mask off, my dear, I think I stopped waiting. For the first time in my life I did not need to hide." He took her hand. They walked slowly back down the gallery, past the painted Ravensmoors, past the Eleanor portrait, past the new portrait that had been hung the previous year. The new portrait was of the Duke and Duchess and their 3 children, in the South Library, in winter, by a single candle. The face in the new portrait did not wear a mask. It had never needed one. She had never been a kitchen rat. She had only been a borrowed name, in a borrowed dress, in a borrowed house, waiting for a real one. She had a real one now. She did not need to hide. If you have made it all the way to the end of this story, my dears, thank you. Thank you for staying with Jenny. Thank you for staying with Edmund. Thank you for staying with Thomas. Hit subscribe if you have not, ring the bell, and leave us a rating between 1 and 10 in the comments below. Tell us where in the world you have been listening tonight, and which moment broke you, and which moment mended you. We read every one. We will see you in the next story. Sleep gently. You are not invisible. You never were. You have only been waiting.